of Slate magazine, and I'm here in Washington, D.C., and Todd, you were returning to Blogging Heads after spending some time with your family after a while. So, introduce what you do.
I profess at Columbia. I profess journalism, sociology, and communications. I write books and stuff. My most recent book is The Chosen Peoples, America, Israel, and the Ordeals of Divine Election.
Well, that's your latest work. My latest work is a piece I wrote for Slate yesterday that's up as we're talking on internal critiques of conservatism, which is one of the most well-covered topics of the past 2 years. But what I wanted to focus on with this was something maybe that can lead us to other topics, which is back when Republicans were losing the 2006 and 2008 elections, a lot of their smart guys came up with proposals for things that Republicans need to do to recapture America. And David Frum had a lot of them. Ross Douthat and Ryan Salam had a lot of them. Former Congressman Mickey Edwards, a lot of guys who weren't leftist or saboteurs or anything, who really wanted Republicans to win a permanent majority, came out and with books about how they needed to tweak these policies and accept that the welfare state was going to be here forever and things like that. And Republicans didn't do any of that stuff. They kind of just voted against everything Obama was doing, and now they're going to win. So I was trying to figure out what they were saying. And so what they were saying was that they were actually still right. They'll be proven right in the end. What it remind me of mostly was, when Democrats explain how the stimulus did work, they'll say it's high unemployment now, but it would be 2 points higher if we didn't pass it. And that's sort of what they were saying. Republicans are doing fine now, but to the extent they're doing fine, it's because they have sided with the white working class like we said they should, and they would be doing even better if they got serious about the things we were saying and they nominated more electable candidates. So you checked it out. What do you think of what they were saying?
Well, this is sort of, I liked your piece and it was illuminating. This whole business of the conservative tattoo reminds me of, I mean tattoo in the drum sense rather than the engraved sense.
I was thinking of the Who song.
But okay. But okay. I think that it seems to me, whatever the state of the world, whatever the state of the party, these guys always know what to say, which is reduce the deficit, cut taxes, cut spending. And, there's a certain rationale for it when the economy's in recession, certain rationale for it when it's a surplus. It is the barrage of choice when Democrats are in office. It was, I don't remember hearing the great drumbeat about the deficit when Bush was running up the deficit, or for that matter when Reagan was. But this is sort of it's the aspirin of the conservative movement. It's sort of whatever ails you, take 8 of these and lie down. So I assume that there's some ideas hidden in this heap. But mostly it seems to me like some combination of a prayer, a mantra, and a talking point.
That there's different ways to phrase that, but it's not really unfair because there is nothing on the left anymore quite like the way that the Republicans view tax cuts and spending cuts. They think it's actually kind of folly to press for details because they'll point to examples, and these examples, Jonathan Chait has ably debunked some of this, but they'll point to examples of how tax cuts has always worked. And I feel like this wasn't always the case, and my speculation is that what changed is that the left for a century or so had this vision of the way the world could work, and then were discredited in lots of different ways. In this country, they were discredited by the failings of some of the Great Society programs. Internationally, they were discredited by the failure of international communism and socialism. So they just don't. They've always been wonky. All these programs made sense because they were wonky, but they no longer have the confidence that the New Deal liberals had when they came in there and said, "Okay, trust us. We're going to spend lots of money and create lots of programs, and it's going to work." Liberals don't do that anymore. They try and tweak things. And if look at the healthcare bill is a great example, because they don't have the confidence that a national healthcare plan is popular or will work. They find all these different little fixes. Whereas conservatives just they still have the confidence. I think that the old and I'm not making a moral comparison or a one-to-one comparison, but the confidence of just the old Leninists almost, that if you just implement what they want, which has never been tried, the economy will explode. And they really say this sometimes, that the arguments for zeroing out all income taxes, replacing with the consumption tax, are that if we do that, we will have the greatest economic growth in the history of the planet. They really believe this stuff. Like, liberals just get laughed at when they talk about that now, but conservatives really believe it. So, there was no interest in the movement for a David Frum or Ross Douthat or David Brooks explaining to them that they needed to get serious and come up with little tweaks to the state that existed. And they said, well, why, nonsense. Like, real conservatism has never been tried, so we're just going to stick to our guns. And, it worked for them electorally. And I'm saying past tense, but all polls could be wrong, or we could have an unemployment report of, that gets it down to 5% this month or something, but otherwise, they're probably going to end up winning without having tweaked anything. It's just a lot of big promises about how giant tax cuts will save us.
Well, I'm not saying anything stunningly original here, but this is a movement, the conservative movement, which is now really the core of a party that is not a governing party. It's a party of rant and recrimination. It has its consistent themes, which make no sense. I mean, it's those awful social democratic governments of Europe which they despise, which all have value-added taxes. I mean, just for openers. That's not a serious proposal. Just as the Laffer curve was a Laffer. What strikes me is the unchanging quality of the rhetoric of the movement. So the other day I was on a Western Massachusetts piece of the Appalachian Trail, and there was one car, I think just one, in the parking lot that did not have a Massachusetts or New York plate. It had a North Carolina plate. It had on it TEA, taxed enough already, with thin words about the party. It had something about socialism and breaking chains. I didn't quite get that one, but there were some chains being broken. And there was something about immigration. And I thought to myself, the slogan of the North Carolina license plate is "First in Flight," and I thought, okay, well, there they are in flight again. The thing is, I remember when virtually, extremely similar terms were thrown at Clinton. I remember a bumper sticker that said, "Bill Clinton, coward, liar, socialist." And it doesn't matter. I mean, on this dimension of what I'm saying, Clinton and Obama are more similar than different in that they're both experimentalists. Neither is a hardcore liberal. Neither is a statist. Both of them tried, in Clinton's rhetoric, to reinvent government. Cass Sunstein, who's now working for Obama, described this as a kind of minimalism, progressive minimalism, I think he called it in an article in the Republic in the 2008 campaign. And so these are actually very far from sort of the old wing, the old, sort of hardcore of the New Dealers. And yet, this drag out the usual slogans, bring out the old bumper stickers. It's, these guys are, with Bill Clinton, it was, he schemed against America and while he was studying at Oxford and visited Russia. Obama, was born here, there, and other places, and is himself, a creature of Kenyan anti-colonialism and so on. I mean, I'm struck, in other words, more by the sort of rock bottom, sort of rancid but preserved quality of right-wing rhetoric than by the divergences.
Yeah, it's really strange because they have, without going that far, I think, a pretty good argument against it. And there's guys like, Grover Norquist, who have just been through lots and lots of Republican comebacks, are pretty good at pointing out that all they need to do is say that what the Democrats are doing doesn't seem to be working because unemployment's really high. They don't need these fanciful theories of how it's a multi-generational plan to destroy capitalism. And but the irony of that, like I was thinking, is just that I don't know what they're really uncovering. I mean, liberals do lots of public hand-wringing and public planning about what they want to do, and it's never a national takeover of socialism. It's just government expansion of the government that they think will work, inspired by stuff that works pretty well in other countries. It's just that they're so, at this point, they've got after Carter, after Clinton, after Reagan, after Bush, they've got so little confidence that this stuff is going to work that it seems like the horizons are much smaller than Republicans. So it seems like weird to me when Republicans who have enormous horizons and point to this grand history and back to the founders, they invent this idea that there's been it's not just a bunch of politicians and intellectuals and academics thinking of what will work. It's that they've been poisoned by they're all part of a poisonous century-old conspiracy to turn America into a progressive country. That's a bad thing. I mean, Democrats really did not see that coming. And I don't know why, because in the Bush years they had something, not similar, but you heard Democrats talk about how what the things they didn't like about what Bush was doing were part of, the Starve the Beast plan on economics, and then, the right-wing evangelical movement's plan to turn America into theocracy. But, that wasn't quite as fanciful and ambitious as what Republicans say. And it's weird. Like I keep saying the word weird because that's the best word I can use to describe it. Just because, really, this party was not ready for that. And I wonder what you think about the movement that has developed, because the Democrats, after having thought they had a movement with Barack Obama, have been scrambling to try and create some sort of public force and public enthusiasm to combat this enormous Republican conservative enthusiasm, with people in the streets and all that. I want to know what your take on it is too, and as somebody who's lived through this and written about this, how important it is who's funding the movement versus who actually is what it's actually doing, because that's the way that liberals try to convince themselves that all this chatter isn't going to matter, or it shouldn't matter, is that it's a bunch of billionaires who have funded these organizations that help organize tea parties. Wait, does that actually matter?
Well, movements are ragged. Movements are messy, and they're not easily pinned down. And whenever one erupts, a big one anyway, reporters go out and they talk to some people at a rally, and they ask 5 or 8 people what they're about, and they get 5 or 8 different answers, and they write the same piece. Whether these are
sometimes we get fewer than that. I noticed that, and I get the same quote every time I go to a tea party now, which is, I was just I decided I could no longer sit on my couch and stare at my TV, and that quote comes up 6 or 7 times. Well, reporters go and get 6 or 7 quotes. You were saying
no, but what those people are saying is, it's time to do something, and there's a passion that's roiling in the country, and people, as soon as you try to pin them down, well, what are you for, and so on, you get divergent answers, you get overlapping answers. You can cite polls to the effect that Tea Party people are actually well off. You can cite polls to the effect that they're actually, cultivated in sort of burned out mill towns, and it's the Tea Party is not a membership organization, just as the New Left, which I was involved in the '60s, is not a membership organization. Movements move and are moved, and they're unruly, and that's part of their energy, is that they're unruly, and they're always they're full of internal dissension, and there are always some people denouncing others as sellouts or off the wagon. Or
well, that's what I'm interested in, because you were there, present for the creation for a lot of the left-wing movements that Glenn Beck now claims had this plan to destroy America that was very well organized in the beginning. So was it?
Surely you jest. I don't think we ever had a plan, for the day after tomorrow. I mean, it's ludicrous. I mean, these sort of projections of phantasmagorical, conspiracies, whether left or right. I mean, there's a long history of them in America, and which of course famously Richard Hofstadter wrote the book on, a generation ago, 2 generations ago.
Although I feel like that
in American life,
which I feel like has been a trap for a lot of liberals, because it's so easy to go back to.
Hofstadter, you mean? Or?
To go to Hofstadter and argue that where this comes from is a seed of cultural paranoia, and it's been very well expressed at multiple stages throughout this movement. But they laugh it off, and I'm sure how much stuff did you guys get from the 60s onward, impugning what you were doing because there was some sort of weird psychological rebellious motive, and it wasn't really seriously about.
Oh, there was a lot of the psychologizing, and there was a lot of searching for the communist money that was flowing in and over charging up our barely existent treasury. There was a lot of that sort of hysteria. I'm amused or horrified, I don't know which, that Beck cites as one of his favorite writers, a fellow with the marvelously resonant name W. Cleon Skousen. W. Cleon Skousen is a name I dimly remember from the days of the John Birch Society, of which he was a leading intellectual. He was at one time the police chief of Salt Lake City, and he was so far out that actually the Mormon establishment threw him out because he was too extravagant. And then he wrote a series of wild books in which dots are connected and you can see money move around and so on. Really, the fanciful is a pale word for this sort of thinking. And, there were people like that. I mean, there were left-wing versions of it. There were left-wing conspiracy theories about assassinations, for example, tended to be left-wing. These ideas that the world actually maps into a sensible pattern and that somewhere there are string pullers, I think actually reflects a certain idea that a certain kind of powerlessness that is projected. Somewhere there must be powers. I can't really do anything, but somewhere out there are puppeteers who are pulling strings and making things happen. It's a classic sort of totalitarian mentality, and
I encounter a lot of that because a thing I've gotten kind of obsessed with is how conservative, and I mostly cover conservatives. I branch out a bit at Slate, but conservatives, activists, and opinion leaders like Beck. It's not really enough for them to find a policy analysis of something. They need to find the secret document from 1965 in which this was all explained. Yeah. Or with analyzing Van Jones, which is still the best way to view this. I think it wasn't. There was a critique people were making of Van Jones about whether green jobs made sense, whether they actually created as many jobs to people like him said they were. But that wasn't the critique that was used against him. It was actually his own signing of the 9/11 petition that knocked him down. But the Glenn Beck and the Tea Party critique, because I would go to Tea Parties and hear about this, was that they found a tape of him saying something about how we needed to change the American system. Ooh. Or that he called himself a communist at one point. I'm covering this Senate race in Delaware among all the other races, and the Democrat who's running is winning pretty handily against Christine O'Donnell. And the right has had this weird focus, not so much on what he's done in office, because he's just been a pretty typical tax-raising county official. It's that in college he wrote a paper in which he said, his friends joked back that his when he came back from a charity mission in Africa, he had a beard. He was like a bearded Marxist. And then the fact that he went to Yale Divinity School.
Whoa.
They focus on
that's
that.
Right next door to Yale Law School, isn't it?
I know. No, that's where I think everything you need to know about Yale from a conservative perspective is the stuff in Sloshing Towards Gomorrah that Ford wrote about how decadent it was. But I'm like, I thought this wow, really? Why focus on a random thing the guy wrote at one point? Why is that the way to go after this? Looking for some moment where a mask slipped and he revealed that this was all part of a long Marxist training program. I mean, this is the argument against Obama that seemed kind of crazy. This Dinesh D'Souza argument. It's not why look at a couple things he wrote in his autobiography for clues instead of where the money comes from and what his policy advisors are planning. It's not just that like reading through this is hard. It's just there's a little projection there. Like the Tea Party movement wants to believe that it is fighting against a much scarier movement with much scarier shadowy motives, not against a bunch of policy people.
Well, look, the fantasy that of the dots being connected or the strings being held by the puppeteer is a recurrent theme in it's the politics of the berserk, and it's at one edge. I mean, this is not trivial. There are elders of Zion who are somewhere holding the strings.
Who fire CNN
structurally, yeah, exactly. There's structurally these notions are all of a piece, and the kind of amazing thing is the lengths to which they go, and the irrationality. I mean, let's face it, we're talking about a lunatic fringe here, and what's dangerous is when the fringe is welcomed into the heartland. But it is a fringe, and it is lunatic. So you have, for example, Obama, who's written at length about his life, being accused by Haley Barbour of being the president who we know less about than any other president in American history. And on the other hand, the guy right here on page 36, the guy's laid out the secret plan to take over America. I'm just old enough to remember in 1960 there were people who were saying when Kennedy was campaigning for the Democratic nomination, it was not unheard. There were people who were saying the Pope will have a secret tunnel into the White House.
Right. With Obama stuff, there's an expression I'm stealing from somebody, I forget who, probably some consultant I talked to. If you've lost an argument. The people who lose arguments like to pretend the argument never happened. So that's the people who lost to Obama like to think that it will say things like, well, it's because the media didn't investigate his college days and his radical ties. And if you actually look at what the media wrote, it was all there. It just no one really found it interesting.
There. I mean, Hannity, I watched the hour-long so-called documentary starring some raving anti-Semite that had Bill Ayers as the secret author of Obama's book, and all kinds of lunacy.
Yeah, that is the one nice thing about Dinesh D'Souza's book is that the old Ayers was Obama's ghostwriter theory doesn't make sense anymore if it actually was Obama's secret revelation of how radical he is.
Well, maybe he needed a collaborator.
But I mean, the left surely must have engaged in some stuff like this. In the new left must have done some stuff like this.
I mean,
right? Like, what were what do you see that is useful for it to?
Well, I mean,
because I feel like the left right now, the White House is like terrible at understanding what actually motivates conservatives. They don't understand. They don't see the next outrage or frenzy coming.
There were, there were a number of what pops into my mind when New Left filmmakers started making documentaries about Vietnam. There was always a mystery. It's a marginal country. It's got 1,000-year history of fighting against the Chinese. Why get worked up about domino theories and so on? And there was a clip of film that showed up in a lot of the documentaries in which no less than Eisenhower stood before a map of Southeast Asia and said something about tin and tungsten. I can't remember what it was. There was tin here, and Indonesia was part of this. It was a way of putting minerals into dominoes, and so that would show up. You see all along. We really care about Vietnam because it's tin and tungsten. I mean, later there was an oil version of it too, as if Vietnam was Saudi Arabia, and it was sort of the heart of the American industrial machine. I mean, there were, and then there's it's sort of there's not just follow the money. There's also follow the bullets in Dallas. Follow Lee Harvey Oswald as he hooks up with, and then fill in the blank, any kind of foreign regime. And by the way, Lyndon Johnson was not immune to this sort of thing. There's a story told by David Halberstam in one of his books about Morley Safer. At this time, Morley Safer was a CBS correspondent, And he'd done this remarkable piece in 1965 where he was with a Marine unit. I think they were Marines on their way into a village in South Vietnam. And there was a shot, a graphic and shocking shot of a Marine setting fire to a thatched roof hut with his lighter, and because of a belief that these people were Viet Cong and so on. So Johnson, so the story goes, was incensed and furious and called his buddy Frank Stanton, the president of CBS, and said, you got to stop this, and also dispatched actually the CIA to find out who this Morley Safer was. And they came back with a report. I believe Richard Helms himself delivered it in the White House. And they said, well, we looked and looked and looked. We went and we interviewed his mother and all his neighbors and so on. And, he's not a communist. He's just a Canadian. To which Johnson is supposed to have said, I knew he wasn't an American. Okay, so Johnson, I think, Johnson got to the point not long after the Vietnam War was accelerated by him, of feeling, that there were, that Bobby Kennedy was pulling strings to bring him down and all that sort of thing. So, this is not a right-wing monopoly.
Well, I'm just wondering what. I don't think these historical comparisons are probably less and less useful with every technological advance we have, because I think what's been new, what I'm obsessed with the Tea Party movement, is I just think media is so atomized now that because you can see not just new information easily, but new video information, you are able, as an activist, to build an alternate theory of what is happening, because you have access to information that is not getting on the normal media. Let me just barge in,
sure. Well, the thought's clear. This is not really new. If I remember in the '60s, if you drove around the South, and you didn't even have to be in the Deep South, you could be in Tennessee or Virginia. There was a billboard that was extremely common, and it showed Martin Luther King in a group of people. And the text said, Martin Luther King at Communist Training School. Now, this so-called Communist Training School was a place called the Highlander Folk School. It was founded by the way, very anti-communist, socialist, one-time farm worker organizer named Miles Horton. And it was, in fact, a place where people who were involved in civil rights and other kinds of causes went for training in various technical things. And, famously, one of the people who was more or less a graduate of it was Rosa Parks, who was not just any old seamstress who happened to sit down on a bus, but was a political organizer. So, I don't know actually where somebody dredged up this photo. It was like sort of YouTube before YouTube, and it was all over the place.
Okay. Well, yeah, it's not new. I don't like this idea of saying something is brand new. What I'm saying is that because of the web and video especially, there's even more, and it's hotter. This is pretty basic. Like a billboard is one thing. A billboard's very makes an impact, but a video of something, it just has such a ability to connect emotionally and to stick with you. There's audio, there's somebody moving, there's body language you can read, and there is the choice that is implicit when you're watching the video that some TV producer made to run it or to not run it. So that's what I think has been has really. I think just talking about Hofstadter only gets you so far. I think that's been really influential in getting the Tea Party movement and conservative movement generally really fired up about stuff that liberals can't quite understand. Yeah, because their news is not just the stuff that we're all paying attention to. It's a lot of YouTubes of congressmen saying pretty anodyne things at town halls or getting shouted down, and it's video of Van Jones from some event. It's video of this. It's an article that has never been fact checked elsewhere, but who knows what fact checking is anymore because they don't trust the media.
This is the berserk quality of some of this movement that things appear to them self-evident, and I read it. It's in a footnote. This book has footnotes. Here's a picture. You can believe 6 impossible things about before breakfast especially easily when, as you say, you don't even have to go to the meeting at your local American Legion Hall to watch a video by Glenn Beck. You can actually call it up on your own screen, and it's this stuff moves very quickly, and we know it also moves globally. These also violent movements, Al Qaeda sort of people are very good at moving their videos around.
Yeah, and I think the left did some of this. If Barack Obama, I guess William Jennings Bryan turned his convention speech into a nomination, so there's not a first for having a successful speech or so that gets you political power. But it didn't hurt Barack Obama that his ability to look really good on video came at the start of the era when video became extremely easy to stream online and people could get themselves psyched without the effort. I think like probably the last generation that even remembers what it was like before you could access any video at any time. I used to have lots of tapes of TV shows I liked because the only way to make sure I would see a TV show is to set a VCR, or even before I had the VCR where the voiceover would be broken, I would have to run home and see it. And then, Obama's rise was powered by the fact that if I'm a liberal and I wanted to get hyped up, I would just call up a video of his convention speech or a video he made to somebody else. And it overpowered a lot of negative stuff about him, or it overpowered a lot of information about him that wasn't really useful to me if I wanted to become a supporter of his. So I think it was powerful in his rise, but then it's just powered a bunch of other stuff that is not good for liberals. And I'm just trying to make a morally neutral analysis here, because I think a lot of the problem with a lot of stuff that has powered the conservative comeback is that it's really not true that Van Jones, in a speech that he gave to a big crowd about about the environment, was his secret plan for communism. The fact that you can click that thing up and see it at any time is just, I feel like it's been really powerful. And what can you do except throw your hands up? Obviously none of this matters, or would matter if the economy were good, and the economy is not good. But one thing we were talking about before was why, in the context of all this, people are so worried about the deficit. Because I cover campaigns and see campaign commercials, and definitely it's the theme that gets hammered all the time by candidates.
And how much of that were you seeing while Bush was in the White House, running up the deficit?
Not a lot. The most you saw was that Democrats, in order to kind of wedge themselves against Republicans as fiscal conservatives, that's the great word that means kind of nothing, great two words that mean kind of nothing, is, Republicans, you can't trust them on the economy either because they don't pay for their spending. But you didn't see anything quite like this, and I wondered if you knew why that was, why the deficit all of a sudden has resurfaced.
Well, the conspiracy chip in my brain leads me to wonder the same thing, and to wonder how much a lot of money actually has driven the obsessive panic about the deficit. Mr. Pete Peterson, has put a lot of money, I understand it, through a foundation into publishing a paper which beats this drum, Fiscal Times, I don't think you buy minds so blatantly, but I think in a situation of extreme anxiety, people do a lot of people glom on to simple solutions, simple answers. Deficit, there it is, one word, 3 syllables. And it, stands for, a sense, government out of control, socialism, impecunious, unthrifty, un-American, socialist, so on and so on. It carries that whole, it's not just one bag. It carries, a whole cargo flight of baggage. And so it's a very useful thing, and it's not hard to, since it is actually not far from one of the central themes of the Republican Party for decades. Okay, by the way, not just the Republican Party.
One of the central themes?
The deficit. the danger of the deficit. I mean, Roosevelt, FDR, came into office in 1933 committed to actually cutting the budget, and did, and
this is right. Yeah,
it actually turned out to be a disaster. I mean, he had a conservative Secretary of the Treasury who eventually he ditched, but. So it's not just the Republicans. This is part of the foundational American myth that we are the yeoman society, that government is an excrescence. It's an imposition of royalty. It's a monstrosity. It's un-American. That we were born free, and if you just get the government out of everything. I mean, it's sort of hilarious. I mean, and go back to the bumper sticker I saw. It occurred, it occurred to me that most likely this fellow had driven from North Carolina to Western Massachusetts on an interstate highway, which was built in the 50s by Eisenhower and repaired by federal funds, and so on and so on. I mean, the people. I mean, just let me rant here for a second because it drives me nuts. The people who believe in the marketplace but also want nuclear power plants built everywhere don't understand or don't want to understand or can't find a place in their cosmology for the fact that you can only have nuclear power plants when the government subsidizes the insurance that these plants have to have because of the obvious dangers. In other words, there is no free enterprise for large phenomena, just as the railroads were not built by the genius of railroad builders, but by donations of land and protection from the U.S. government. So this is a phantasmagorical idea that America was built by freestanding entrepreneurs.
Well, more than that, I mean, I don't know why the conservative history of America, which is different than the liberal history of America, or the actual history of America, neither of them is quite like the actual history, assumes that there are lots of quotes. Again, I get back to how there are just a few quotes that get put on signs and bumper stickers, and those are what we use as history instead of what actually happened. No one seems to remember that the way that the Treasury got off the ground by assuming the debts of all the states during the Revolutionary War.
Exactly.
No one is there is this alternate version of history where the founders never wanted us to run a deficit and always want us to pay down our debt. That's not actually how government works. You sound like a snob when you talk about this. The editorial I sound like a snob saying these people just don't understand economics or something like that. But they actually, that is economics. Like if I love all these small businessmen running for Congress, and I'm glad they are. But they'll talk about how we can't sustain a deficit, and I think, really, did you start your business without taking a loan, or without running a deficit for a couple of years? Because I know people who've started businesses and they did. I mean, you struggle and then you make money and get it off the ground. Now, does government work exactly like that? No, but liberals could. Could liberals do a better job explaining this? Well, yeah, but that's always the cop-out. Liberals could do a better job explaining and never do a better job explaining. And they've made a bunch of mistakes, but they've never even tried to grapple with the facts of economics that really sound kind of nutty and are easy to make fun of, but are actually the way things work. And they're also the conservative version of economics. Look, Republicans are running for Congress now everywhere and saying, on the one hand, they want to cut the debt and cut the deficit. And on the other hand, in the same sentence often, saying they want to make sure we don't get rid of the Bush tax cuts. Well, the Bush tax cuts, walked out 10 years, are going to increase the debt by $4 trillion, right? Except they believe that if you cut the taxes, revenue is going to come in. That you're going to run more of a deficit. This is just the way this stuff works. And it's weird because, I don't know why liberals have never. I don't know if it's unwinnable because kind of everything seems to be politically winnable if you talk about it a lot. Why is it unwinnable? This argument that yes, the way your family budgets, by trying to avoid debt, is important. Although, if you have a credit card, you want to get a little bit of debt.
I notice how American families are freed of debt.
They're not. No, American. It's you shouldn't have too much debt, but it's okay to have a little. But you should also make the point that the government. And
sometimes we call them mortgages, by the way.
Yeah, I plan to have a nice big debt someday if I'm successful. But But the way that your family balances its budget every month is not the way the government does. I mean, should the government go crazy and run something unsustainable? Sure, but the argument is should be over what's unsustainable, not whether you should be spending money that you don't have at the moment in the first place. Because that's, if you're a Keynesian, you spend it. If you're a Laffer-ian, you're going to spend it in the form of tax cuts. Like, everyone agrees that it's really weird. I'm ranting now. You've inspired me with my own rant. But it's really weird. I don't know how we continue year after year to have a politics that doesn't even engage with the way economics work.
This is the way. This is where the conspiracy ship kicks in, because the belief system you're describing is so delusional that you have to ask whether it's floating, on its own, or whether it's getting a lot of help and from people who don't have to be right because they have so much money they can invest in shoddy ideological goods, and that's where I start wondering about the Koch brothers and their investments in this movement, and the Freedom Works, the Dick Armey people, and
with deficit Pete Peterson
on the deficit in particular. I mean, because this is flat earthism with dollars, and it has a currency that is it's stupefying, and it just never goes away.
There is a role here played by the people who spend lots of money advertising and making movies and going on TV and getting people to talk about this stuff on TV. That has an impact. I mean, I think there's a psychological pull to this stuff in the first place because no one likes the idea of spending money they don't have. And in terms of, I understand it. In terms of how the federal government runs a deficit, it's sort of scary to think that the government is spending all this money and it has to be paid back someday, and there's nothing you can do about it for every 2 years.
Well, then here's Paul Krugman, who keeps obsessively asking the question: if the deficit is so dangerous, why is it that long-term bonds are so cheap? And is Mr. Peterson responded? It's completely unserious, this claim about the hysteria. I mean, nobody thinks that massive deficits should be run forever, but when you need them, you need them. You need them in war. We ran on giant deficits in World War II, and you need them when you have more urgent problems like 17%, on and underemployment.
Right. That is a thing I like about the Tea Party movement. It actually has more answers for how to get this stuff under control than Republicans do, because
what are they?
Well, the answer is total austerity and getting rid of big government programs that we wouldn't have to pay for. The point of Glenn Beck's big rally on the Mall, there was a point. I mean, it didn't sound like there was. Sometimes there was that America, in order to confront its massive debt and the threat of big government, Americans need to be ready to get rid of Social Security and Medicare and things like that, and get back to charity. Get back to their churches so they could provide for each other and provide for the elderly through their community instead of counting on the government to do that. And he didn't use those. I think you have to go back to look at his long transcript. I forget how he phrased it exactly, but that's what he kept saying. Is we just need to, when he says we need to return to our churches and things like that. I guess it became clear to me when I was talking to people in the audience. The way they interpret it was that, I like my Medicare and my Social Security, but it's not going to be there for the next generation because we spend so much money. So we need to get rid of this stuff and return to helping each other out.
But then we're still in the land of delusion. Because I think of a number of studies, of polls that were done in which people were asked, what do you think we should spend on foreign aid?
Yeah.
Okay? And, you've seen for decades.
Yes.
And so people say something like 20%. We got to cut it down to 20% because they think it's 40 or 50 or 80% now. No, it's actually under 5%. Ditto about how much of the federal budget or any budget is spent on welfare. Mm-hmm. People have deluded ideas, and of course I think it's ideologically, it's intellectually criminal that such notions are respectable. and rather than being laughed out of contention as they deserve to be.
Well,
I mean,
it's just the way that history gets retold. Obama had this toss-off line in his Rolling Stone interview that I honed in on. I guess it must have really been a toss-off because he hasn't been hitting it since then. But he was referring to economic downturns of the past and mentioned what he called the Reagan recession, which actually was a thing. In 19...
How could it be denied?
No, there was Reagan was elected because the economy was in a downturn under Carter. And under the first 2 years of Reagan, unemployment swelled. I think we're at 9.6, and I feel like it got to 10 point something. I won't make it a number because the number will be wrong. But it got above 10%. It stayed there for a while, and that's why Republicans lost ground in the 1982 midterms. Not a ton of ground, but some ground. I mean, there were a lot of factors. And then, so the massive tax cuts he passed in the first place, they rolled some back. Economy was recovering. In 1984, Walter Mondale loses, according to popular memory, because he said he was going to raise taxes. What he actually said was, President Reagan and I will both raise taxes. He won't tell you I just did. And then Reagan raised taxes. Right. So the thing that frustrates me is I do think there are tax cuts that make sense and like simplifying the tax code are good ideas generally. However, you can't really have this discussion if people think that the economy boomed in the 80s because there were lots of tax cuts, because that's not what happened. I mean, there were lots of different things that happened. There were the Fed had the ability to meddle with interest rates that it doesn't have right now. And it's really frustrating. If you cover politics, everyone says a lot of stuff that's based on pseudo-history. And people in the audience respond to pseudo-history. I mean, if you go to enough town halls, people will say things like, actually, the stimulus prevented a lot of government workers from being fired, and it helped the employment, the employment rate is higher than it would have been otherwise. And people in the audience laugh because they don't think it happened. But it objectively happened. And I don't know I think it's just that conservatives are bolder about taking this history and just throwing it into the end zone than Democrats are. Because when Democrats run for president, they know that, maybe they don't even know this. Maybe this is what they've been told. You got to promise people that you're going to cut their taxes and cut the deficit. You can't actually explain this stuff to them. I think it has a massive impact because one side's pulling the argument, the other side's letting it get pulled.
There's always a fringe that's disposed to hark back to the mythic origins and to hold on to to try to burnish the golden age they think has slipped away. And what's dangerous, I think, in a situation like the one we're in now, you get a growth of this sort of Manichaean thinking when these ideas become respectable. And they never have to prove themselves in practice. The fantasy feeds on itself, and the people who are most committed. I mean, there's a classic piece of social psychology, the one that gave rise to the concept of cognitive dissonance, a book called When Prophecy Fails, that shows that, insofar as people have invested a lot of energy and work in a fantastical idea like there's going to be a great flood and only the believers will be saved and rescued by flying saucers. The more passionate you are in attachment to that idea, the more likely you are to hold on to it, even when it's falsified by experience. The day arrives, the saucers don't. And some people fall away and they say, well, that was wrong. And others redouble their energy, redouble their commitment. They say, oh, we must have misread the sacred texts. So what you're dealing with here is a style of thought that is self-reinforcing, and there it is. I mean, it's. Yeah. I mean, I think unfortunately it's a human disposition to take such fantastic prognostication seriously. What's really dangerous is when it has a political party and apparatus that at its disposal, and the Republican Party's intellectual bankruptcy, I think, has been evident. I think to anybody who's serious. But of course, that's obviously a hideous elitist thing to say. So I take it back.
I mean, no, I definitely think the Democrats deserve to lose Congress. And maybe they wouldn't have deserved to lose it if they'd governed in a way that liberals wanted in 2009. Who knows? But I generally, it's a fair rule that if your policies fail to reduce unemployment the way that you said they were going to, you should lose some. And is it unfair that the Senate blocks all the things that you think would really fix it? I guess that's unfair. I mean, you could talk
Sounds
about
unfair to me.
It is. It's pretty unfair. I mean, that's actually the thing I'm not looking forward to. That sounds cruel. One thing I'm curious to see is if the Tea Party rolls into power and discover that nothing they want to do can pass the way the founders wanted it to, and that there's this kind of made-up filibuster on everything. I wonder if they'll start actually getting attention in the conservative media for the fact that the filibuster is kind of a joke. These lectures about what the founders wanted will become kind of interesting if all of a sudden they get 51 votes to repeal health care and it doesn't get repealed. That's not fair. Where's that in the Constitution? It's nowhere. I'm actually
excited
to see
James Madison didn't invent the filibuster?
the 60-vote rule for everything.
Well,
I want to see how they start to deal with that.
Again, I wonder where the serious conservatives are and how they can hold up their heads.
It's tough. Like I talked to some for that Slate piece to bring it back around, and they exist and they want people to make sure they're listening to them when they start to govern again, so that they aren't surprised that they just can't pass a massive tax cut, can't repeal health care, and none of their math adds up. But they get ignored by the 20 million listeners of Rush Limbaugh and the millions of viewers of Fox News, and the people who just don't need to know much more than things look pretty wrong, who has the simplest explanation for why they're wrong. So I want to, we've been talking for a while, and we cycled back. That's nice. I want to close with something, I guess, in the radical vein about Bill Ayers, who was not. You were not at SDS together, were you? He joined later.
He's later, but I remember him from the latter '60s. Yeah.
So Bill Ayers, who you palled around with, it used to be a professor at the University of Illinois Chicago, and now he's not. And he applied for emeritus status and was denied it because it's nice that you can sometimes actually hone in on these things, because I've been spending a lot of time dealing with campaign financing groups that won't admit who they are. These guys admit who they are. It was Chris Kennedy, the son of Robert F. Kennedy, took offense at Ayers because Ayers dedicated one of his books to Sirhan Sirhan. So he said no, and the students and faculty. He
is, I believe, the chairman of the board of trustees of the university. Yeah.
He's the chairman of the board of trustees. So their students and faculty are starting to rally to see if they can get this guy emeritus status after all. So what do you make of this?
Well, first of all, I take it that at the University of Illinois, emeritus status is I heard on NPR that it's something reserved for distinguished faculty, whatever exactly that means. At some universities, it's just automatic. It just means you're retired. But I gather they have a different nomenclature at the University of Illinois. So in that case, look. The book at issue, again, according to the NPR report, was a tract issued by the Weather Underground in the mid-'70s that evidently was dedicated to Sirhan Sirhan. That was sort of how they were thinking then, and this is a disgraceful thing. It was disgraceful, disgusting, appalling then. I don't feel that if there isn't a legal right to emeritus status, then the fact that one was once attached to such ideas doesn't strike me as irrelevant. And the cause of Bill Ayers' emeritus status doesn't quicken my pulse.
It doesn't. So,
in the
this is one of those great
happy sense.
Yeah, this is one of those great cable news issues where neither of us has any control over it, but we both.
Well, it
would be asked whether we. I mean, I met Ayers in 2001 when he was touring his book Fugitive Days, and he was really unapologetic about. He didn't even kill that many people as a terrorist. It's just that. he was technically a terrorist.
Mm-hmm.
He was completely ineffective and wrong, and felt that he was right, and he was nothing he'd ever done. He felt the need to apologize for. It offended me because he comes from a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
At Northwestern, where I attended, one of the big buildings is named after his father, who bought the building.
Was, I believe, chairman of the electrical company in Chicago.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a part of me viscerally does not mind to see a rich kid who can't admit that he did horrible things not get rewarded for that, and I'm actually kind of happy with how this turned out.
I believe in academic freedom. I don't think that people should be fired, because they harbor even bizarre political beliefs. But in this case, it's not a firing offense. It's a question of an honor, and I don't think there's a constitutional right to an honor.
Okay, well then that's agreement across from the liberal sphere to whatever the heck sphere I'm in. I have no idea anymore on this issue. Well, let's cut it off here. I think we had some good discussions.
Dandy.
Let's
enjoy it.
Where else can people read your stuff?
Well, I've been blogging on the entanglements section of the New Republic online, tnr.com. I blog at Talking Points Memo, TPM Cafe, for openers.
Okay, and I will continue blogging at Slate and writing articles for Slate. I'm going to go finish one now. So it was great talking to you.
Likewise.
Have a good day.
Great. Okay.
Thanks.